Good day, Pierce College students. Welcome to week 6, macroeconomics. We will begin our week 6 investigation of economics by looking at the course module homepage for this week. Chapters 34 and chapters 35 are our focus of study, money and banking, and the creation of money. And so, as always, you have the same learning opportunities for the week. You can participate in the weekly Zoom session or watch the recording of this video. You can download and read and go over the lecture notes with the practice questions and answers. Those are available right here on the week 6 online macroeconomic PDF, right? And then you can review these video lessons. I strongly suggest you do that, especially the one on the financial crisis. We're not going to get into that too much tonight, just to save time, but there is a question on the quiz about the financial crisis. So student responsibilities are the same as every week. Please finish the week 6 Connect assignments, which are associated with, hey, obviously, chapters 34 and chapter 35, right? Then participate in the weekly discussion. So this week, the discussion revolves around Bitcoin. And the question is Bitcoin money today? Will Bitcoin be money in the future? It's good to introduce this question now because we're going to be talking about what is money, what are the 3 functions of money. When you are answering this question, make sure you concentrate on this aspect of the question. According to this video by CNBC, by The Economist, according to this video by The Economist, is Bitcoin money today? Will Bitcoin be money in the future? Something is money if and only if it performs the 3 functions of money. So we're going to go over those shortly. I'll remind you this as we go over those. And then study the contents of these 2 chapters for the week 6 multiple choice quiz. All right, let's get into some of the content for week 6. The first question to be answered in week 6 is something you might kind of find funny. What is money? What is money? So money is what money does. Sounds like a kind of a cop-out, but money is what money does. Well, what does money do? For something to be considered money in society, it must perform 3 important functions. One is a medium of exchange. That is to say, it's readily accepted in exchange for goods and services and resources. So I get to go to work, I get paid in dollars. I go to the shopping center and I want to buy some groceries for my family. I can buy groceries with dollars, right? I need to pay my rent. I can pay my rent with dollars. So it facilitates all this economic exchange. That's what we mean by medium of exchange. Without money to fulfill this function, we would have the cumbersome system of bartering. That is to say, you have something I need, I have something you need, you have something I want, vice versa. That's a major challenge for the economy because inevitably you'd have to have what's called a coincidence of wants all the time. There'd be no economic exchange if you don't have something I need and vice versa. One important economic consequence of medium exchange is this idea of specialization. You see this over here, number 3, both geographic and human specialization. So I'm an economics educator. I do not want to consume any more economic education because I've already taken micro and macro introduction. I've taken international econ, right? I've taken all kinds of economics classes. But having money as a function of a medium exchange allows me to get paid for performing a service in which I'm specializing, and that allows me to consume other services. So you have some crazy, wicked, smart, intelligent woman who is from the University of New Mexico, who works in theoretical physics, and she works with quantum mechanics, and she's developing a quantum computer, which is going to help all of our lives. But she doesn't want to consume a lot of that service that she produces. She wants food, shelter, clothing, and vacation for her family and such. So money allows human beings to specialize in working in the area where they have an expertise, right? We also have geographic specialization, which is facilitated by money being a medium of exchange. So think about this. We grow oranges and other citrus fruits in Florida, and we grow potatoes in Idaho. We then exchange the Floridian citrus fruits for the Idahoan potatoes. Money allows for not only human specialization, but geographic specialization. And this promotes productive efficiency, which we covered earlier in the year. So the first function, medium exchange. Unit of account. Something is only money if it allows us to easily facilitate price comparison. So when you go shopping, you think, okay, I have $100. I can buy a brand new pair of sneakers, or I could buy a new set of earbuds, right? They're both about $100. A nice pair of sneakers or a pair of earbuds, both about $100. Right? That's true. So money does this for us. And what it does is it actually quantifies something we studied earlier, opportunity cost. So it acts as what we call a yardstick. Right? If you take a little kid shopping and you say, look, you can have 4 of these bouncy balls, or you can have 3 of these books. Like, they don't know that the books add up to $20 and the bouncy balls add up to $20, but they're able to easily compare the value. And that's what money does for us all the time, right? Unit of account. Say, okay, I have the money either to go get my car serviced for $100 or to go to a concert for $100. Money functions as a unit of account. In a larger sense, money as a unit of account also allows us to add up all the economic activity. We covered this earlier when we talk about GDP. Now, most of us don't spend every dollar we earn in the week that we earn it. We transfer purchasing power from today to the future. So money has to hold its value over time, right? So when you think about this, what costs $100 today, a year from now is going to cost right around $100. And you might be talking about, you might be thinking to yourself, well, inflation has eroded the purchasing power of dollars. You are absolutely correct. And we will talk about the value of money as determined by changes in the price level soon. But for the most part, we all agree that $100 today is going to be worth about the same as what it can purchase in goods and services a month from now and a year from now, right? Now, what do we mean by money? Over time, we've had 3 types of money. We've had physical objects of money, where gold or silver are money, right? Then we went from physical objects being money, commodity money, we call that, to commodity-backed money, where the physical objects are still the money, but we have money that represents, we have dollars that represent, paper money that represents the physical object. Believe it or not, today we have none of that. Right? We do not have a gold standard. Right? We have what's called a fiat currency, fiat, F-I-A-T, fiat currency. So there's no intrinsic value of the dollars in circulation, right? So the only thing that gives money value then, is we're going to talk about, is the government's ability to keep money circulating relatively scarce compared to its demand, right? So we're going to talk about all money being debt soon, right? So the whole world works on fiat currency. We went from commodity money to commodity-backed money to fiat money. Now, a term you might want to become familiar with when you study this chapter is called liquidity. That is to say, how quickly an asset can be converted into other goods and services. By definition, money is the most liquid of all assets. An illiquid asset might be something like a fine piece of art where you might have to take it to an auction to sell it. Might take some time to get it appraised and stuff. Right? A stock, say you have 100 shares of Microsoft, that's pretty liquid because you know the value of those shares are made known to all investors on trading platforms every day, right? And liquidity will definitely change depending on market conditions. Okay, so when the government starts to talk about money, right? And when our Federal Reserve starts talking about money and we start talking about how much money is in circulation, we need to have a definition of money. We need to have a definition of money, and we need to be able to explain what we consider money. That sounds funny, but this is an actual serious economic question, right? So the most narrow definition of money is what we call M as in money, one. You see this up there for M1, the most narrow definition of money, right? So when we're determining what is in the money supply, what makes up the money supply, M1 is the most narrow definition of the money supply. And it only includes two things, right? It includes currency, which is coins and cash, right? Federal Reserve notes, we call those, that's cash. And then money in checking accounts. So all money in checking accounts is considered money because think about it. Medium of exchange, unit of account, store of value, checking account deposits, they fulfill all three of the characteristics or functions of money, right? So they're money. And most large transactions take place through checks and the transfer of funds through the checking system. Matter of fact, we don't even use physical checks anymore. Most of them are electronic. So that's the most narrow definition of the money supply. The definition of the money supply that we are really interested in is slightly broader, and we take everything we just mentioned. So currency, which is coins and cash, plus checkable deposits, money in checking accounts, and we add a few what we call near monies. So money in savings accounts, money is in money market accounts, and then small term deposits of $250,000 or less. And so these can easily be converted into cash. Like they're highly liquid. So when you hear on the news that the Fed is either increasing or decreasing the money supply, M2 is the measure of the money supply that our nation's central bank, the Federal Reserve, our monetary authorities, this is the one that they closely track and that they affect. Okay. This little graph here shows you M1 is 2008, but M1 as percentage of the total money supply is about 18%. And it shows you, this is in billions, or 7.4, it's in trillions of dollars. You can see there's a huge increase in M2 starting in about the year 2000. We've got a skyrocketing amount of M2 in circulation. Currency and check deposits, M1, they haven't changed much at all, but there's been an exponential growth in M2. All right, what about your credit card? Well, that's actually not money because it's just a short-term loan agreement between you and your lending institution, you and your bank, right? Now, here's going to sound something very funny, is that all money is debt. What does that mean? Well, okay. Any money that's in checking accounts, that is owed to the customers that have deposited those funds into that lending institution, into that bank, right? Into that bank. And all cash is debt issued by our nation's central bank, the Federal Reserve. So like, man, I wish I had more debt, but that's a strange way to think about it, but it's actually true. So what gives money value, right? There's three things that give money value. One is the fact that it's so readily accepted, right? There's a term called the global greenback. Dollars are accepted almost everywhere on planet Earth. When we invaded Iraq years ago, we overturned Saddam Hussein's regime. In his 7 palaces, he did not have Iraqi money. His walls were lined with dollar bills because he knew dollar bills are worth way more than Iraqi money, even if it has the picture of the president on it. So acceptability is a big factor. Second thing is what's called legal tender. It says on the money that it's good for all debts, public and private. But the most important characteristic or feature that gives money value is the idea that it's relatively scarce. So when you think about our good old friends, supply and demand, there's definitely demand for money, right? And then there's a supply of money. And together, the supply and demand for money, right, are going to determine how much we need money in circulation. too much supply, we'll have crazy amounts of inflation, not enough supply, and we will not be able to facilitate economic activity. So it's the government's job to keep the supply of money relatively scarce, enough in circulation to facilitate economic activity. So I'm not going to have any problems on the quiz for this particular concept, definitely in your Connect assignments, but it's an important idea for you to grasp. When we talk about the value of the dollar is inverse related to the price level, which is a fancy way of saying higher inflation erodes the purchasing power of your dollar. So if we look and say, okay, what gives the dollar value? We know that, right? This idea of relative scarcity, but the value of the dollar is inverse related to the price level. So if we have inflation, right, like we've had last year of about 6%, 6.5%, right, that erodes the purchasing power of money that you are holding. Now, there's this term called hyperinflation, like World War I, after World War I in Germany. Hyperinflation meant that the German mark was worth basically nothing, right? So the German mark went from being worth 1 mark to 1/1 billionth of a mark in 18 months because of hyperinflation, right? All right. Let's talk about the money market. I'm going to show you the money market, then we're going to break it down. This is a graph of the money market. It shows you the demand for money, the supply of money. On the bottom, or the vertical axis, it shows you the quantity of money demanded and supplied. And on the vertical axis, it shows you the interest rate, right? So let's go through this piece by piece. Whenever you get a graph, make sure you identify what you're measuring and where. So supply and demand, you're familiar with. Horizontal axis, this is what you're normally familiar with. Quantity. Normally, when we look at the vertical axis in a supply and demand situation, a market situation, we call this the price axis. Notice this is not price. We don't call it the price of money. We call it the real rate of interest. So the purpose of this exercise, when we look at, say, certain supply of money, certain demand for money, the money market helps us determine the interest rates. And we know that lots of economic activity are interest rate sensitive. So for instance, housing, very interest rate sensitive. Automobile purchases, very interest rate sensitive. When you talk about companies and companies deciding which projects are going to be profitable, right? When companies are deciding whether they're worth their profit motive to invest in new machines and equipment and tools and projects, extremely interest rate sensitive. So the money market ultimately influences interest rates, and interest rates definitely impact the economy. So the easier of these two to explain is this green straight up and down, we call perfectly inelastic supply, but the fixed amount of money in circulation, right? Our nation's central bank, the Federal Reserve, they control the money supply. Our nation's central bank controls the money supply. So when you look at SM, just go back to what we just studied a few moments ago. The supply of money in this graph is the same exact as M2, right? So it's all the things in M1, which is coins, cash, checkable deposits, right? So currencies plus checkable deposits, and all those near monies, right? Money market accounts, money market mutual accounts, saving deposits. So when we look at the money market graph, right? This supply of money, that's M2, the money in circulation, and it's controlled by the Federal Reserve. Our downward sloping demand for money, it's made up of two separate aspects of the demand for money. So we're going to go over both of those. But remember that when we look at the demand for money, we're always going to be talking about the total demand for money. So we're going to build the total demand for money right at this moment and say, what goes into the demand for money? All right, so the demand for money is made up of two different aspects: the transaction demand for money and the asset demand for money. So what do we mean by the transaction demand for money? Every single solitary time an economic activity takes place, it is necessary to have money available to facilitate that transaction, right? Every time an economic activity takes place, we need money to make sure that economic activity happens. So that's what we mean by the transaction demand for money. So we need money to facilitate economic activity. So the transaction demand for money, this part of the demand, it's going to vary directly with nominal GDP, right? Which means if we have more economic activity, this part of the money demand will shift to the right. When there's less economic activity, it'll shift to the left. So the transaction demand for money, right, it sounds like what it is. Every time an economic transaction takes place, we need money to facilitate that transaction. The transaction demand for money varies directly with nominal GDP. And it says here it's not influenced or it's independent of the interest rates. Now, money is an asset, but there is a cost to holding money. The opportunity cost of holding money is foregone interest. In other words, if you are holding cash, you're foregoing potentially receiving interest by buying something like a bond. So the asset demand for money varies inversely with the interest rates. So what does this mean? It says, okay, when interest rates are really high, the asset demand for money is going to be virtually nothing. Because you say, man, there's a huge opportunity cost to holding money as an asset when you can get 10% on a bond. So if you had $10,000 in cash, right, and interest rates are 10%, just by taking your money and buying a bond with, exchanging your cash for a bond, you're going to earn $1,000 a year. That's a huge opportunity cost to let that go. When interest rates are really low, say like 1%, right, your $10,000 will only make $100. So there's not as much opportunity cost of holding money as an asset when interest rates are really low. So the asset demand for money varies inversely with the interest rates. You take the transaction demand for money plus the asset demand for money, that gives you the total demand for money. Right? Now, when we bring these two together, again, when we look at the supply of money, which is M2, controlled by our nation's central bank, the demand for money, right, which includes both the transaction and the asset demand for money, we bring them together, right? The quantity of money supplied and demanded, the interest rate, that determines the domestic interest rate in the economy. So given a certain supply and demand for money, we're going to have an interest rate in the economy. As pictured on the board, the interest rate is 5%. Now, as you are already aware, there are many interest rates, and we're going to talk about that next week. We have, the Fed funds rate, we have the discount rate, we have the prime rate, we have the rate on credit card interest debt, we have the rate on mortgage interest debt, we have the interest rate on student loan debt, right, with the personal interest, right? So there's all kinds of interest rates. So when you look at this money market, say, okay, this is the first step in determining all of those interest rates, right? So we're going to get to monetary policy next week, but it's always good to look ahead and to, sort of get some of this down. So if this represents the current money market and the Fed can control the money supply, the Fed can increase or decrease interest rates by decreasing and increasing the money supply. So right now, the economy has an interest rate of 5%. Well, let's say that the Fed is worried that the economy is overheating and that inflation is a problem, and they want to increase interest rates. The Fed can increase interest rates by lowering the money supply. If the economy goes into the doldrums, right, we start at 5% and we go into recession, the Fed wants to facilitate some economic activity with lower interest rates, the Fed can increase the money supply. So in essence, that's monetary policy, which we will go over in much more detail next week, right? Okay, so let's talk about our Fed in a little more detail. Our nation's central bank, right? The nation's central bank. We had a few attempts at a central bank in the history of this country. The current version of our nation's central bank, the Federal Reserve, came to life in 1913, right? Now, something's very important for you to understand. We have a central banking system. So it's not actually technically correct to say the central bank of the United States. Right? We have a central banking system, which we will explain how the system operates in a moment. First, we have what's called 12 regional banks across the country. You can see all these numbers here. One in Boston, New York, Philly, right? Washington, D.C., Richmond, Cleveland, Chicago, St. Louis, Minneapolis, KC, Kansas City, San Francisco, Dallas, and Atlanta, right? So we have these 12 regional banks, and then keep putting the system all together. We have what's called the Board of Governors. So this little diagram helps you visualize. At the top in charge of the Board of Governors, so that's the Fed chair, the vice chair, and then 5 other members of the Board of Governors. The current Fed chair is Jerome Powell, right? The current Fed chair is Jerome Powell. We had Alan Greenspan, then Ben Bernanke, and then Janet Yellen, who's actually now back in government, Treasury Secretary. The other side of the Washington, right? And now we have Jerome Powell. So Jerome Powell is the Fed chair. There's a vice chair and 5 other members of the Board of Governors. Right? So the Board of Governors gets input or information from what's called the FOMC, the Federal Open Markets Committee, which includes 5 of the presidents of the 12 banks we just mentioned. And there's actually some business people from the community that have input on the FOMC as well, right? So this is how the Fed works. Basically, Jerome Powell, the Fed chair, is the buck stops here person. But you have the Fed chair, the vice chair, 5 other members of the Board of Governors. And with the assistance of the central banks, they set what's called monetary policy. So what are the functions of our Fed? Some of these are mundane and some of these are extremely important. Some of them aren't that important and some are rather important. So the first one is issuing currency. If you look on any dollar bill that you own, it'll have a letter on it, and that letter will denote which of the 12 regional banks issued that money, that currency. Right, that one's kind of unimportant. The next one, setting reserve requirements and holding reserves. This is an extremely important function of the Fed. And it's changed dramatically since our pandemic economy. But banks take deposits from their customers. Banks are required to hold some of those deposits as reserves. We call those required reserves. And then the Federal Reserve actually holds those reserves. Now, we will talk later next week about how monetary policy has changed over time. So we're going to keep this in the most simplistic historical explanation for this particular function of the Fed. For the longest time, the reserve requirement was 10%. So if a bank took in $500 million from depositors, it had to keep 10% of those deposits as required reserves. By 10% of 500 million would be 50 million. And then the bank was free to lend out all of those excess reserves, so 450 million. Right? So by setting this reserve requirement, our central bank influences the amount of lending that can take place not only by one single bank, but by the entire banking system. The third function of the Fed is lending money to banks, thrifts, and this should say, and other financial institutions. So the Fed is what we call the lender of last resort. If a bank gets in trouble, the bank is not liquid. Right? If the bank is in possibility of going bankrupt, right? Our nation's central bank can grant that bank a loan to get through a challenging time. So the Fed lends money to banks at an interest rate called the discount rate, right? And an interest rate called the discount rate. For the longest time, this was what we called an announcement effect, or just sort of a passive tool of the Federal Reserve. because 97% of the time, banks didn't get in trouble. So this was on the books, but not all that relevant as far as practical application, because most of the time banks did a great job of making certain that they were solvent and they didn't need the assistance of the Fed. Right? But then the financial crisis of 2007 hit, and all of a sudden the Federal Reserve had to expand its role as the lender of last resort, right? And become, in essence, the institution that rescued the banking system, right? It also sort of expanded the eligibility of which companies could turn to the Fed and borrow under this auspice of lender of last resort. The next one, providing check collection. This one's just kind of mundane. You write a check, you send it to someone, they cash it in their bank. The Fed makes sure that the funds get transferred and then the bank, the check gets back to the original bank. All right, this one's interesting. Fiscal agent for the U.S. government. It's not super crazy important to macroeconomic outcomes. It's just something you have to say, okay, well, somebody has to make this happen, right? So what does this mean, fiscal agent for the U.S. government? Uncle Sam, Washington, D.C., all right, our federal government, they take in lots of tax revenues. Right, so in the year 2022, the federal government took in about $4.5 trillion in tax revenues. Well, they can't just keep that under the pillow of the president, right, in a big bag. So just like you need a bank to write checks and pay bills and such, the federal government needs a bank. So the federal government has a bank account at the Federal Reserve. So unlike people like you and I, we can't go down to the Federal Reserve and open up a bank account. The federal government has a bank account at the Federal Reserve. So think about the massive number of checks that our federal government writes. They write Social Security checks. They write checks to fund Medicare and Medicaid. They write checks for things like education, and they write checks for housing vouchers and such, unemployment. So our federal government needs a bank to write checks against, just like you do. All right. Now, the next one is important. This one idea of supervising banks. So it's a pretty broad term, but theoretically, each of the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks is commissioned to oversee banks and thrifts in their area. In other words, to make sure that they're operating according to the rules and that they are what we call solvent, right? So supervising banks. The last function of the Fed is one that's most important. We just saw this in the graph of the money market, controlling the nation's money supply. So that's the most important function of the Fed. All right, so I'm going to review that very quickly, even though this will be covered in much more detail next week. All right. Remember, the Fed controls the green SM there, the supply of money, and that represents M2, right? So that's coins and cash, which we call currency. Right? It's all the money in checking accounts, and it's those near monies, which things like money market accounts and saving deposits and such. Right? So the Fed controls the nation's money supply. If the Fed wants to slow economic activity, they can decrease the money supply to push up interest rates. If the Fed wants to facilitate more economic activity, the Fed can increase the money supply to cut rates. Right? All right, that's an important background about the Fed. Now, one of the characteristics about our nation's central bank stands out above all others. And we want to highlight that here. Right? When we look at this, it says Federal Reserve independence, right? Established by Congress as an independent agency. So theoretically, the Fed is protected from political pressures. The Fed chair, the vice chair, the other 5 members of the board of governors, they're not up for election. They're not elected officials. They can take measures which they think are proper, which may not be popular, right? So for instance, in the 70s, when inflation was out of control, but interest rates were high and the economy was slowing, the Fed realized that they had to get price level under control. So they pushed up interest rates even further to the detriment of some businessmen and women. Right? It slowed the economy, but the Fed was correct. It took 2 or 3 years for the Fed to be proven correct, but they took unpopular measures which were necessary for the U.S. economy. So that's what we mean when we talk about the Fed being independent and being able to take actions that may not be altogether popular. Okay, let's move on to our next chapter. Our next chapter, we talk about how banks and thrifts create money, how banks and thrifts can create money. And we start with a little anecdote called the goldsmiths. So imagine, if you will, a time when we still had commodity money. So we're going to keep this simple so that you can understand the numbers. Let's assume that in our commodity money economy, the gold shekels were the money. And let's assume that there were 10 merchants who did all the trading. And then at the beginning of our little scenario, each merchant had $100,000. Sorry, 100,000 gold coins. So we got 10 merchants, 100,000 gold shekels. That's 1 million pieces of gold, or in essence, $1 million, right? So the problem with using gold was twofold for the merchants. Number one, it was cumbersome. And number two, there's a possibility that you could get robbed. Right? So it wasn't altogether perfectly safe. So merchants, in an effort to reduce the cumbersome annoyance of carrying gold around and to become much safer, they employed the assistance of what's called a goldsmith. So the goldsmith protected the gold coins, right, and issued receipts, paper receipts that represented the gold. So the first thing that happened in this situation or scenario is that we replaced commodity money, gold pieces, with commodity backed money. Each receipt represents a shekel of gold, right? So the merchants are super crazy happy with the new system. It's really easy to use these paper receipts as money. Everyone knows their money. It's a lot safer to store them. It's not cumbersome. They can tuck away in your shirt as opposed to carrying all this gold onto the boat and such, right? So everything's going along so well that the goldsmith becomes super crazy bored, because the goldsmith's like, all right, people love this receipt system, but nobody needs me anymore, right? The system works so well that we don't need the goldsmith. Then along comes someone and says, all those merchants come to our town, and if we had a general store, we could sell lots of stuff to them. And the goldsmith agrees with this assessment, but then he says, well, why wouldn't you build that, that store? And the person says, well, I would if I had the money. And then putting two and two together, the goldsmith realizes, geez, I could just print up more of these receipts, and you could use them to acquire the resources you need to build your general store. So in essence, what's happened here is twofold. Number one, when the goldsmith granted a loan, and we'll call it 100,000 new receipts in the economy, number one is that the money supply increased. So by granting a loan, new money was created. Right? By granting a loan, new money was created. The second and more important long-term observation is that we went from what we call the 100% reserve banking to what we call fractional reserve. This is important. This is what makes lending a possibility in a modern economy. Fractional reserve banking. So let's think about the goldsmith, right? And what's happening in this economy. Before, we had 100,000 gold pieces for each merchant, right? 10 merchants, 1 million gold pieces, 1 million receipts, a 1-to-1 ratio. Now the goldsmith grants a loan, and of course the money supply goes from 1 million to 1,100,000. When that goldsmith gives the loan to the person who wants to make the general store, the money supply expands from 1 million receipts to 1.1 million, right? Likewise, we now have this fractional reserve system. There's only a fraction of gold in the vault, representing, as opposed to all of the receipts that are circulating in the economy. Now, let's say that the person who started the store was enormously successful and in 2 years decides, I earned all the money, then some, I'm going to pay back the 100,000 receipts that I borrowed. So when a loan is granted, money is created. We just proved that. And when loans are repaid, money is destroyed. I know that sounds kind of crazy funny, but it's actually true. When a loan is paid back, money is taken out of the economy, right? Now, we've already covered a bunch of really important lessons. We went from commodity money to commodity-backed money when the goldsmith issued receipts. We talked about the ability of the goldsmith to increase the money supply by granting a loan, right? And we talked about that's only possible through a fractional reserve system. And then we talked about the idea of, geez, when money is repaid, when a loan is repaid, money is actually destroyed. One important idea that we're going to talk about is what's called prudent lender and bank panics. Now, the goldsmith was probably pretty safe by creating one loan because it would be difficult to notice. It would be difficult to notice that there's only, there's another 100,000 receipts in circulation. But what if the goldsmith created 10 loans and all of a sudden there was double the amount of receipts, and all of a sudden the original 10 merchants are like, I don't know, there's a lot of these receipts flying around, and all of a sudden people got nervous and they all showed up at the bank one day, the goldsmith shop one day, and said, we want our gold back, right? It's like that scene from It's a Wonderful Life, right? So that's what's called a run on a bank or a bank panic. Now, I just told you when we talked about the Fed Reserve, the Federal Reserve, and the functions of the Fed, that one of the important functions of the Fed is what we call setting the reserve requirements and holding reserves, right? So when we look at these functions, the second one here, setting reserve requirement and holding reserves, right? Setting reserve requirement and holding reserves, banks only required to hold 10% of deposits as required reserves. I said, okay, if a bank takes in 500 million in deposits, they can lend out 90% of that, 450 million. If they lend out all the money and then all the customers show up the next day and said, hey, we want to withdraw our money, the bank would have a problem, right? So banks today definitely operate on fractional reserve banking system. What prevents bank panics or a run on a bank is not the reserve requirement. The reserve requirement does nothing for that. What happens is we have this program called FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. All banks pay into this insurance program. If there's ever a bank that goes belly up, your deposits are insured up to and including $250,000, right? So in the old days with the goldsmiths, we needed the goldsmith, aka the banker, to be a prudent lender, to be careful and to make good decisions with lending. Today, we still want banks to operate with a good deal of prudence when it comes to deciding who gets a loan and how many loans to grant, but it is FDIC insurance program that prevents runs on banks. All right, let's go ahead to the last important lesson of today. This is called the money multiplier. What we're going to do is we're going to take the basic premises and the basic ideas that we learned from the Goldsmith example, and we're going to move into the modern banking system. The only difference between the Goldsmith example and today is that there's no more gold. Right? The banking system today operates on the fractional reserve banking system. We just talked about the idea of required reserve and how much banks are allowed to lend out. These three terms are important. Right? Actual reserves, required reserves, and excess reserves. A bank is in a position to create new loans and therefore introduce new monies into the economy if the bank is holding excess reserves. So let's stick with the example I provided earlier. ABC Bank took in 500 million from their customers. They opened yesterday, and let's assume they had lots of people wanting to use their banking services. And by this afternoon, they got 500 million in deposits. So their actual reserves are 500 million. How much of that can they lend out and therefore create new monies? Well, if the required reserve is 10%, if the required reserve is 10%, that means that out of the 500, and let's just type this in so you can see this, right? Out of the 500, we got like, okay, 450, sorry, 500 in actual reserves minus their 50 in required reserves, right? 50, 10%. That means they would be holding excess reserves of 450. All right, so ABC Bank would be in a position to lend out $450 million, right? That would be the numbers. So that's just one bank. How about the banking system? Well, we're going to introduce this concept called the money multiplier. So we take the amount of excess reserves that the first bank is holding. See that figure right here. In our last example was 450. And then we multiply that by what we call the money multiplier. So how do you calculate the money multiplier? The money multiplier is not the difficult concept. It's 1 over the required reserve ratio. So if the required reserve ratio is 10%, you take 1 divided by 0.1, and that works out to be 10. So when you have a banking system, right, let me type up an example here for you so you can see exactly what I mean. Right. We'll say the first bank was holding, I'm going to make this font bigger for you. There we go, that should be good. Right. We go over the formula one more time. Okay, we just calculated that ABC Bank, the first bank, they can create 450 in new monies. Why? Because they took 500 million in deposits. If there's a required reserve ratio of 10%, they have to keep 50 or 10% of that as required reserves. They're in a position, they're allowed to by law to lend out 450. But that's only one bank. How much can the banking system ultimately create new loans? Well, our formula says if we can calculate the size of the money multiplier and then times that by the initial excess reserves, that gives us the maximum checkable deposit creation of the entire banking system. So I'm going to go through this piece by piece using the numbers we just introduced. Right? So MM for us, money multiplier, that equals 1 over RR, the reserve requirement, which equals for us 1 over 0.1. Right? That's 10%. I gotta put 1 over, sorry. 1 over 0.1. Right? 1 divided by 0.1 is 10. So our money multiplier is 10. Right? How do we get that again? The formula says to calculate the size of the money multiplier, take 1 over the reserve requirement, required reserve ratio. We said, okay, what are the required reserve ratio is 10%. 1 over 0.1, which is 10%, equals 10. Right? Then we look and say, okay, now we need the formula to calculate the potential money creation of the entire banking system. So maximum checkable deposit, which is the same thing as saying total potential loan / money creation of the banking system. We need the money multiplier, which we just calculated, and we have to multiply that by this number here, the amount of initial excess reserves. So we put, enter. I'm going to put this total money creation equals excess reserves times money multiplier. So what is our numbers? What are our numbers? Well, we have initial excess reserves of 450, and we have a money multiplier of 10. All right. So what is 450 times 10? Right. This is going to be a big number. So, okay, 450 times 10 equals, whoa, 4,500, right? So go back here. The entire banking system, right? But remember, that's in millions of dollars. That's in millions because we started with 450 million, right? The entire banking system creates 4.5, right? That's in hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, there are two important assumptions here whenever we employ this formula. So if we know the size of the money multiplier and we know the amount of excess reserves that the first bank is holding, we can calculate how much total money can be created. But that is based on two huge assumptions. First, banks lend out all of their excess reserves. Second is that new loans or new money is immediately redeposited into another bank. So this money multiplier formula, which calculates the potential amount of new monies that the banking system can create, is based on those two important assumptions. Right, what are they again? Number one, that banks lend out all of their excess reserves. And number two, that new loans are immediately redeposited into another bank, right? Now, here's a little example provided by the textbook, but you have to be careful because there's one change in our little approach here. This says, okay, what if Bank A has 100, I will just keep it 100, you can forget the millions, it's even easier for you to comprehend. Takes in $100, they have no excess reserves, but they take in $100 in deposits. But up here it says required reserve is 20. In this example that's in the textbook, there's an assumed required reserve of 20%, not 10%. So don't let that throw you off in this example. So the first bank has 100 in actual deposits. If the required reserve is 20%, they have to keep 20 on reserves. They're in a position to lend out 80. So they lend out 80 in new monies. So they lend out all of their excess reserves, and then this new loan is immediately redeposited into Bank B. Right? Our two assumptions. All these excess reserves are loaned out. This new loan gets deposited into a new bank. All right, look what happens. Now this bank has 80 in actual reserves. They're allowed to lend out 80% of that. This $16 is required reserves, 20% of 80, right? And you say, okay, they're going to lend out all their excess reserves, new money created 64, and that's deposited into the next bank, right? And so on, and so on, and so on, and so on, until the total money creation is 400. But let me show you why the money multiplier formula is so powerful and convenient. Remember this number here, right? Initial excess reserves is of 80. So Bank A had actual deposits of 100, required reserves of 20, initial excess reserves of 80, right? Also remember that the required reserve ratio is 20%. So we said, okay, 1 over 0.2, right? Not 1 over 0.1, 1 over 0.2 is 5, right? So we go back to our little formula here. This is no longer 1 over 0.1. This is 1 over 0.2, right? And 1 over 0.2 is not 10, it's 5. So the size of our money multiplier is 5, right? That means we got to take this number here, which was 10, the money multiplier, and so that's not 10, that's 5. If the required reserve ratio is 20%. And we didn't have initial excess reserves of 450. We only had initial excess reserves in that first bank of 80. And then remember, 5 times 80, well, look, 400, right? So we took the required reserve ratio, 20%. We calculated the money multiplier right here. Then we said, okay, $80 in initial excess reserves. Where did we get that? That was given to us in the problem. First bank at 100 in actual reserves, 20 in required reserves, excess reserves, 80. 5 times 80, look, we came up with the same number. $400 the banking system can create in total new monies, assuming banks lend out all their excess reserves, and new reserves are immediately redeposited. Sorry, new loans are immediately redeposited into another bank. All right, my friends, make certain that you review these 3 functions of money when answering the discussion question, because it says, is Bitcoin money today? Will Bitcoin money be money in the future? And that's all about the video from The Economist. The Economist video does a nice job of talking about and mentioning these functions. So answer the question, is Bitcoin money today? Will Bitcoin money be considered money in the future, right? Then study all the concepts we covered in preparation for the quiz. All right, good luck with everything this week. Don't hesitate to reach out if you need my assistance with anything related to our study of macroeconomics.